Okay, it's 10 o'clock in the West Coast, 1 o'clock in the East Coast, so it's time for us to begin our session. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. I see we have 184 people online at the moment. So I think for us, it's time to say, let's rock and roll. So welcome to the Lean Innovation Educator Summit. We have a great group of people here to share with each other and learn from each other. You know, what brings us together here today is, really an urgent response, an urgent need to be relevant and effective in the era of COVID-19. So the why, who, and what, is pretty clear. Why we are here? Well, to build community, to support each other in challenging times, to discover best practices, and really learn what each other are doing that we can take away and gain these tools and ideas that we can put to work right away. We're building on a great legacy. I mean, we all know who the key players are and the key contributors. And, Steve Blank and others have built a true legacy through lean innovation, the Lean Launchpad, I-Core, the whole series of Hacking 4 courses. And together we begin to build a learning community. And that's what we are. We're trying to exemplify what we teach our students, which is to they build learning teams. Well, we're making sure we're building a learning community where we learn from each other. So for today's session, we have two main themes. The first is innovation discovery, really discovering from each other, what is working and what we're trying, what's new. We're going to look at it in two different ways. We're going to look at existing courses and the challenges and successes in converting and expanding and scaling existing programs. And we're going to be looking at the significant challenge of standing up brand new programs in the era of virtual education and distance learning. We're also going to focus on the pressures of societal change, the Black Lives Matter movement, and we're going to focus on that lens through the lens of equal opportunity and making sure that what we're doing can bring these same tools to create equal opportunity for all. So who's in the room? Well, a couple hundred of us are right here, right now. We have over, as of this morning, this slide that was prepared last night said 997. We hit the magic number of 1,001 registrants. And I'm really super pleased to see this number of registrants. I'm super pleased to see the several hundred that'll be with us today at some point. But this community is going to communicate with you, not just through today's session, but providing a repository to capture lessons learned. So even those that don't make it to today's session can be part of the community and contribute, share, and we'll curate and preserve and redistribute. There are over 200 institutions represented and perhaps even 30 countries. Well, we asked you what you cared about. And I could go through graphs that look like this and we analyzed responses. But if you boil it down, there were 5 key areas where you told us in advance of the session that you had places you wanted to focus and you wanted to make sure we captured our learnings. And they were capturing insights, enabling effective team processes, supporting team project definition and ideation, conducting meaningful interviews, and then, of course, securing those interviews. When we break into our discussion groups, where we'll have small group learning opportunities We really want to focus on issues like these and get underneath them and peel them apart and find out what are the burning problems in each. I want to, before we get into this, thank our organizers and outreach sponsors. We have could not have done this at all with the support of the Common Mission projects, and the outreach support from GCEC and VentureWell was really great in being able to reach you and let you know this was happening. So what are we going to do today? Our schedule is 3 hours and it's packed. We're going to have some presentations on these key themes of standing up new programs and responding to societal change. Then we're going to break into subgroups. We're going to have discussions among peers. We're going to capture the lessons learned. And we're going to come back and have a feedback session from each subgroup. So we're all experienced educators. We're familiar with this process. This process works when we lean into it and we contribute and come back and share. And then we'll close with some closing remarks and observations, and we'll be communicating with you how we're going to share the lessons learned, how we're going to curate them and capture them. These people need no introduction. You know them if you're in this community. Steve, of course, the principal author and creator of the methodology. Pete, leads the effort to extend this into the Hacking 4 community with the support of Steve Weinstein. Alex, of course, is a principal author of the Business Model Canvas, and we're so pleased to have you with us today to learn what you're doing to extend things into the virtual world. And Grant is a leader in diversity and innovation at Howard and bringing opportunity for all, and he'll give us some guidance in that direction. Of course, we have many more leaders among you, and some of you volunteered, some of you have been voluntold, right, to step up and be breakout room leads. We really appreciate your support. You have the major burden of making this session a success. This is where the work's really going to get done, and you're going to capture these lessons learned and bring them back. And these individuals are only going to have a minute or two to share what they learned in their lesson, in their breakout rooms, but then we're going to reduce that to writing, to a single slide, and they'll be part of the curated repository. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and really invite Steve to kick us off. Steve Blank.
Great. Thanks, Jerry, and thanks to all of you who've taken time out of your day to join us. Next slide, please, Alex. Alex?
There you go, Steve.
Thanks. So, I don't know how all of you reacted to we now have to teach in the pandemic, but, when we were first told that we have to teach virtually, I was just kind of sitting there stunned thinking, well, wait a minute, an experiential class is all about getting out of the building. As you all know, I even have, my underwear monogrammed with "there are no facts inside the building, get the heck outside." And I was kind of like at a loss of how are we going to do that? How are we going to teach students to experience learning from customers if they can't get out and learn from customers? How will customer discovery work? How are they going to build MVPs? Our pedagogy, that is the way we teach, was just fundamentally designed to get into people's faces, and if you know the phrase, is see if their pupils dilate when they actually talk to potential customers or partners. And I kind of was just pondering for days, is this the end of experiential classes? And I think what you're going to hear in the rest of these presentations, that we've discovered that we could maybe do more or better classes with using Zoom and video conferencing. And it actually taught us a bunch of surprising things we never would have figured out. And I think at the end, when we all do go back in the classroom, this is actually going to make our teaching a lot more effective. At least for me, it's going to change how I approach doing customer discovery and validation with students and actually building classes. And in the next 4 examples from Pete and Steve Weinstein and Alex and I, we're going to share with you what we've learned and what was harder and what turned out to actually be easier. And so with that, next slide, Alex. So as I said, Pete and Steve Weinstein and I and Grant and Alex will kind of give you some examples of what we've learned and some of the challenges, and more importantly, what were our takeaways that perhaps you could use and think about, and we could discuss in those breakout sessions. Next slide, please. So just as a reminder for all of you who teach Lean Launchpad, and for some of you who don't, the classes have some common characteristics, whether they're hacking for defense or hacking for oceans or hacking for recovery or Lean Launchpad or ICOR. Number one, they're team-based. They're experiential. So by team-based, it's not individuals taking a class with lectures. It's at least how we teach it, it's by application and by interview. We teach the Lean methodology, which is Alex's business model canvas, or our joint mission model canvas, customer development to have students get out of the classroom and actually test and discover whether their hypotheses they articulated on that canvas are true. And we have them build minimum viable products, often weekly. And we encourage and we expect learning and discovery through pivots. We typically teach with a flipped classroom. That is, the lectures are, at least the basic lectures are homework, and their homework is actually what they present in the class. Is here's what they learned by getting out of the building every week. And we kind of have a philosophy that says, you know, we have a short period of time to teach them a lot of stuff, and the best way we've found to connect is just with relentlessly direct feedback, respectful but absolutely clear that, you know, perhaps you ought to consider X or Y. The other common element is the Hacking for X programs, Hacking for Defense, Oceans, Diplomacy, etc. Not only have students working on these experiential projects, but the things they work on are not their projects. They're actually come from sponsors' problems. And that's double the work if you're putting together this class. That is, you have to manage sponsors, you have to solicit problems from them, you have to get them engaged, and you have to offer students a portfolio of problem sets. Now, all this should be kind of, if you're teaching a version of Lean, I think kind of well understood, and you probably live this every day. But I just wanted to remind everybody, this was kind of the challenge you face and try to teach this virtually is, you know, how do I recruit teams? You know, how do I, in fact, you know, have students do outside interviews? How are they doing MVPs? How do you flip a classroom when it's already kind of flipped? And what kind of feedback will students actually take when you're not physically in the room with them? And how do you actually deal with sponsors now virtually? All these problems were compounded as we had to go online. And at first, I have to tell you, we all kind of looked at each other, at least as we started teaching our classes, and went, well, I don't know how this is going to work, but let's go do it. And as I said, I think we were surprised how well they turned out. And I'm going to let, I think, Pete go first and talk about how Hacking for Defense as an example of a class actually turned out. Pete?
You're on mute, Pete.
Hi, now I'm here.
You bet you
push
are.
the red button at the top.
You know, you would think as number of Zoom sessions I do that would happen automatically for me, but for whatever reason, it's always that way. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us. You know, regardless of where you are in the world, the insights that we've been able to gather from many of you, starting to going back to last year when we ran the last educators conference, to those universities that have participated in the rather intrusive AARs that the Common Mission Project has done. All of that has been hugely beneficial in helping us better understand where some of the issues and advantages lie in not just the pedagogy for how we do this, but in particular for what advantages we gained by going online and what things we lost. So I kind of talked through hacking for defense and what I have learned collectively with Steve and Joe and Tom and a few others teaching the Stanford class, but also what I get from my seat looking across 40 some odd universities in the United States and a bunch of them in the UK, and what I see across the problem sponsors that are involved in the process. So Alex, give me the next slide. And first, a bit of history. You know, we started hacking for defense as an experiment accidentally at Stanford probably 5 years ago. It has since grown up into an integral part of the congressional strategy to retain, recruit, and gain new talent in the public service. And has become a critical part of the Pentagon's efforts to actually be more innovative and entrepreneurial in the approach to national security. So it enjoys considerable support, not just at the university level with students, but also within Congress and with the Pentagon and the Ministry of Defense in the UK and a bunch of other places. We'll sit at probably 40 universities this year in the United States, and I think 7 to 10 in the UK, and a smattering of others in other places in the world. As Steve said, we started literally in the spring. I think we started teaching in April. And about February or March, we realized we, in 30 days, had to figure out how to completely take hacking for defense online. And our concern was, because this is a highly experiential, highly social course, and as we've learned, it required double the work. Now, students in a hacking for defense class spend their time first validating that the problem they were given by somebody in the government is in fact the right problem. They have to identify a potential solution that solves the pain points of a beneficiary who is not necessarily the buyer. And then they have to validate that there is a pathway through the rather arcane system of defense to actually deliver that solution back to the beneficiary. It's a lot of work that causes students to talk to and recruit from a very diverse network of folks who sometimes don't necessarily see anything eye to eye. We were surprised by how available people were to actually sit through interviews. And we're talking, 4-star generals, members of Congress, who suddenly, because they weren't traveling and because they didn't have a bunch of gatekeepers in the way, were able to get on a 30-minute to an hour-long conversation with students and have a really good discussion about what they were trying to do. The challenge, though, was because it was all virtual, people couldn't go. I couldn't send students to sit on an aircraft carrier in San Diego to look at a particular problem. So they lost the physical context of what they were doing. We spent a great deal of time going through our own syllabus, trying to figure out how to deliver this. And we've always said that teaching this class once a week on a 3-hour format face-to-face is exhausting. I could probably 10x that trying to do it across Zoom. It really is exhausting. We tried to break that up a bit by bringing in guest speakers. And I think we were uniquely successful in getting some really great senior leaders and former generals, former heads of major agencies to talk about the challenge they have in keeping up with changes in the world and the challenges of actually recruiting the kind of talent they needed to do, and just the challenges of working inside the bureaucracy. And I'll wait for you to catch up with me again, Alex, to take me back to my slide. We'll get there. Okay. The other challenge that we have faced, and not necessarily just within an online environment, is we have always recognized that these classes produce some unique talent that was energized and wanted to continue to work on the project, but we had no place to put them. Quite frankly, we're out of cycle with their the way they actually select and determine what internships they're going to work on the summer. We're out of cycle with the way that they have to work during the summer in order to afford to go back to school. And quite frankly, these are nascent teams, even in the case where they wanted to start a company, aren't ready to go out into the world and do something. So we had to create I'll call it a safe place where you could validate first that you had the right team, that they had the right plan, and help them build the asset they need to actually form a company, or find a way so that they can continue to engage with a government client. We have prototyped it for a couple of years with H4X Labs, particularly with the Stanford class, and finally this year, when we finally opened it up full on to the Stanford course, we were a little surprised when 8 of 8 teams leaving the course all signed up to enter H4X Labs, which is being run and directed by Steve Weinstein, to continue their work. Not all of them plan to continue to be companies, but they all wanted in some way, shape, or form to continue to work on their problem with a government sponsor, which we think is probably the best of all outcomes we could produce. Next slide. Yeah, I'm gonna go a little fast here. Here's the bottom line: is, in my humble opinion, I think that in many cases we gained a great deal by going online. We gained the ability to engage a massive number of mentors and advisors and other people to participate as part of the class, simply because the logistics for them went away. It was easy for them to log into a Zoom session. It was easy for them to engage with the students. And we find that the more we engage in the classroom with somebody, the easier it is to recruit them to actually work with the teams afterward, whether it's just for a couple of hours or whether it's sticking with us. We've gotten to the point where we actually had to recruit what I would call a mentor wrangler. We have so many potential mentors and advisors who are willing to help us now. It is almost a full-time job for one of the teaching team to keep up with them. As you can see on the slide, there's some good. I will say it again, teaching online is not bad. It's not better, it's just different. It has shifted the burden of the work that we have to do to different areas than, in some cases, that we weren't expecting. Next slide. The tough part, I would tell you, we would not be where we are without the exceptional support of the teachers' assistants that we had for the Stanford class, both from a technical standpoint of their ability to figure out what versions of Zoom to use versus other things, how to mash other IT systems together, and then how to wrangle students and instructors and advisors and mentors and problem sponsors all into a mishmash of folks who continue to make progress on a week-to-week basis. I can't say enough about the need to recruit high-quality, energetic, useful TAs to support a course. We found that we had to shift a great deal of our work to actual recruiting, and in some cases, we had to do it one-on-one to get not just people interested in the course, but actually to get the teams built, because they were no longer socializing together in large groups on campus. And in many cases, we found ourselves with teams that were spread out in 3 different countries, all trying to bring them back together. We have not yet solved the loss of the physical touch of the course. And I think that's the one downside of where we are today is we really need that context. We really want to get the teams off campus and out with their students or out with the problem sponsors working on something. So I think if you asked me at the end of the day what the best scenario is, it is an online class that has physical field trips to actually get some of the work they're doing, and potentially physical office hours if you have to get there. I think, and I would say it's a mixed bag. I think in many cases, students were overloaded because they didn't have the cross-leveling amongst the students outside the class that they typically would. That in some cases that impeded the pace of the learning in the class. And I'm happy to explain what I really meant in a Q&A session if somebody wants to pick apart at that. But I think that's the last I have, and I think we're set up to answer some questions at the end of this, but I'll hand this right over to Steve, I think, who is talking
Yeah,
next.
we'll go to Steve, but I do want to just reinforce your point that if folks would post questions in the chat, that's a way with a couple hundred people online that we can lean into your questions and have an open discussion right after we finish these first 4 presentations. Thank you. Steve, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Steve Weinstein. I'm going to talk a little bit about creating a new program in this time. I was lucky enough with Radhika and Sophia to create a program called Hacking for Oceans, or Hacking for the Environment Oceans, where oceans health meets entrepreneurs. So it's a kind of a little bit of the diversion from the original, Hacking for programs, because we're looking at using it in the social impact space. And how do you kind of change society, everything from policy on down. And it was a heavy lift. I will tell you, it was a heavy lift to kick this off. Next slide, please. All right, so what I'm talking about is we stood up 2 classes, one at UC Santa Cruz and one at San Diego simultaneously. I would tell you that in retrospect, it was only due to timing and that everybody was starting to go online, and that people were looking for classes to add to the curriculum that could work online. So we were very lucky in being able to put off these 2 classes. But the problem was, and if you do this, and even out of COVID time, there really wasn't any infrastructure in these departments, primarily in the ocean sciences department, to basically adopt such an entrepreneurial program. And so there was no existing infrastructure. What did that mean is we spent a lot of time building up internal support and buy-in, one-on-one Zoom calls, getting, Radhika was spending a lot of time with various people. We finally found, and I would say that regardless of when you do this, is that you need the domain level expert in the university to be full on bought in. Unless you get that person, I don't see how you could pull this off. The second thing is that, when you created this from scratch, is that we really had to kind of introduce everyone to this idea, all the way from sponsors on down. And we kind of found that getting sponsors who were excited about that actually was kind of a virtuous circle, in the sense that they helped us within the university and elsewhere. And then you have to do all the standard stuff of websites and getting up funding potentially for these student teams. And the hardest part was that recruiting was a one-on-one exercise, literally down to the student in some cases, literally down to the mentor, the sponsor, the advisor, the faculty member. These were one-on-one exercises. And then the other hard part, and we learned this as we did it, is that we had to change a little bit the pedagogy to be this new audience that by almost definition doesn't have an entrepreneurial base. All right, next slide, please. All right, so the good thing is we pulled it off. We had attendance, we had great things, we had sponsors and mentors fully involved, we had students that were jumped in, but we also had, when we were thinking about it, the good other things that happened is that this kind of, when it's online, it appeals to a different crowd. People who normally wouldn't think of taking these sort of classes were kind of spending their time at home looking for a different class to take, and they kind of jumped in. That was a good thing. We actually had, you know, a very diverse student body taking the classes. We had people from all these different departments who would have normally not felt uncomfortable about joining, felt, great, let's join this class. The bad of that is they didn't know what pool they jumped into. But it was really good. And so the barrier to join this class is lower, which was a surprising. Wouldn't have thought that at the end. I thought, you know, knowledge would have been better, knowledge of the class, but it turned out to be completely the opposite. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, given that, you know, and some of the things Pete already talked about in terms of getting out of the building and field trips and all those other things, but for us, there were even more barriers. There was a cognitive overload because we were teaching not only scientists to be entrepreneurs, but people from different cultures and different diverse backgrounds, and undergraduates and graduates, and all of these different groups of people, that what it meant not only to create a company, but create an entrepreneurial company that, you know, could become a startup, and working with all these different sponsors and mentors and advisors. And I would think if we went back to it, I would even change the curriculum a little bit more to do a little bit of pre-training and get everybody on board a little bit earlier, and have some online videos and online interactive sessions to get them involved. But it was very rewarding for everybody who took it. And it's, but you had to take this step back because we couldn't get them really to jump in with full on. And so one of the things we changed in the class, particularly, is that we kind of pushed them to actually do something tangible, right? And even though the methodology is MVP driven and it's hypothesis driven, we realized that for some of the students that they needed to do something in their spare time. And we realized that we had to kind of get them to actually start working on something, even though it might be wrong, just so they had something to kind of rally around. Okay, next slide. Okay, so there were a bunch of lessons learned. The first one, if I was doing this again, and I mean, I plan on doing this again a lot more, is that you kind of need to have something for the students to grab on so they know what pool they're jumping into. They need a unifying little bit of focus. It can't just be oceans. You might, so what that means is you probably need to get your sponsoring problems super early. If I did this again, I would get my sponsoring problems very early, right? Rather than normally, a lot of times we do it in a parallel effort, problem, sponsors, mentors, students, class. I would kind of take the step back and get problems earlier so that you can use those as a rallying way to generate demand for the class. Even though we had a full class in both universities, I would say it would have just changed it a little bit. The other one I mentioned earlier, you need department level juice, okay? I know all of you as educators know this, but I would continue to say you need to do it. The other thing is that you should do a little bit of pre-work with the teams to let them know what they're in for. Even though we had info sessions and all these standard stuff that all of us already do, is that they didn't really internalize it. So if I was going to do this again, I would have like almost like role playing during the info session, so they understand what relentless direct feedback means. Because there are a lot of cultural differences. Besides time zones, we had people from all over the world, from all sorts of backgrounds. And there was a lot of cultural difference because of the diversity that the class attracted. We are hoping that we can take this class because it was successful online, and we're looking for people to take it, and we're going to put up all of this stuff online, and the syllabus, the list of activities, everything else. We know it works. You know, maybe they don't get close to product market fit and a good pathway forward, but they get really far down the pathway. The sponsors are happy. The final results were all kind of, we got a couple of quotes from people who said that we did more in 10 weeks like normal than a lot of these classes historically have done. Please contact myself or Radhika if you want to participate or learn how we did it more. And there was one other thing is we also kind of broke up the Zoom sessions into kind of one-on-ones with instructors. We had breakout rooms where we challenged the team-on-team exercises. Some of the exercises I think Alexandra's going to talk about, or Jerry's going to do with our own breakout rooms. These were all ways to make engaging the students, because as we did it in the standard way of 3 hours online, but we really broke it out that the students really were basically sitting back on their heels for only less than an hour. Thank you.
Super. Thank you very much. Grant.
Yeah, I think it's me, Jerry.
Oh, I'm sorry. I apologize. Steve Blank, of course. Thank you. Hacking for Recovery.
Thanks, Jerry. And I just want to, before I talk about Hacking for Recovery, just want to kind of reemphasize a couple of the innovations that Pete and Steve did. Number one was this notion of breakout rooms, is that we quickly found out, as Steve said, having students sit for 3 hours in the classic format just was going to fry their brains, and we were going to lose them pretty early. And Steve and Pete created and experimented with what do you do in breakout rooms, and is it students, teams talking to each other, teams having extended conversations with professors, etc. And they could discuss that in some detail, but I just wanted to point out that was a new addition to the traditional format of our syllabus. And the other one for me, which was completely heretical, which is, if you know, when I teach Lean Launchpad or I-Core or anything, this notion of a guest instructor was just verboten, meaning, no, it's not about someone else, it's about the students and what they learned. But in this case, particularly in Hacking for Defense, we realized we had the opportunity to get some people who were never available as guest instructors, who actually, if we recorded, could actually be useful in the future, not only our class. And through Joe Felter, one of the co-creators of the class, and Pete and I, we went out to our Rolodex, and we had General Mattis and Petraeus and McChrystal and head of cyber from NSA, and a whole set of speakers that actually were relevant to the class, and I think were a good introduction. Condi Rice, etc. And those are available online, as Pete mentioned. So let me talk about creating a new class from scratch called Hacking for Recovery. This came about when Tom Bedicare, one of our co-instructors at Stanford, and Todd Beisch, all simultaneously suggested perhaps we could do something to help for the pandemic. And you know, I realized I wasn't very good at sewing masks, and probably couldn't create a ventilator with a 3D printer. So what else, you know, could we do to kind of help? And so I started to think about, well, maybe we could help new and existing businesses. That is, people who wanted to take advantage of the change in the business environment, or existing businesses looking for alternatives to new customers or new channels, or how to reconfigure their business, maybe think through new strategies. And so, next slide. So we created a class called Hacking for Recovery. It's started at Stanford with me and Tom Bedicare and Steve Weinstein and Pete and a whole group of other instructors, but immediately got picked up by Steve Auerbach in Hawaii, who said, well, we have a huge problem in our state of massive unemployment, because our economy was built on travel and hospitality. And we love to figure out how to get businesses to be thinking about how to recover and think about new business models. And so what we did is, I had been teaching a 5-day version of the Lean Launchpad class at Columbia University for the last 5 or 6 years in a block week. And how that worked was we basically stripped down the traditional Lean Launchpad / I-Core syllabus, and ran it for 5 days, 8 hours a day. That is, the students were completely immersed in class lecture, but then spent the rest of the day, all, daylight and nighttime, talking to customers for 5 days. And it turned out it was a fairly, and still is a fairly successful program. And when we ran it at Columbia, we were running it with 25 plus teams at a time, multiple instructors, multiple rooms, breakout sessions, etc. And so we said, well, why don't we start with that syllabus, but even strip it down further. We took out a bunch of reading, we tested some new material in our first version. We tested the Market Navigator, which is a great tool, but it turns out the speed required to kind of onboard students to use that new tool was just too large for a 5-day class, but actually we still might use it in our next semesters of Lean Launchpad. And more importantly, we recorded a whole new set of lectures, and we put them online, and those are open sourced. Next slide. And we used, the existing logistics at Stanford, faculties, TAs, admins, and we funded it basically with volunteer work. Tom Bedicare was great at getting a whole set of what were called DCI fellows at Stanford engaged, worked with the Stanford summer program to get it co-listed as an official Stanford program. And then the heavy work started. Recruiting is just, I'd say, of everything about teaching online for Lean classes, the toughest part now, which was, at least for us, hard before, it was even harder now, was team formation and recruiting. And maybe it's a Stanford thing, though I don't know if the rest of you have this problem. We're competing with about 130, literally 130 other innovation and entrepreneurship classes offered every quarter. And we still manage to get oversubscribed, but it's not because we just sit there and let students enroll. We actually go out and market and posters and all kinds of things to get students kind of aware and engaged. And even now that we have word of mouth, it is just, I can't emphasize what a heavy lift this is. And I have to tell you, when I started teaching, I thought, well, I shouldn't have to do this, and people should just kind of love to come to the class because it's so great and they'll know all about it. And it turns out that's just simply not the case, at least in our environment. And so there's an enormous amount of front-end work of info sessions, and we have those slides if people are interested. They're open sourced about how we present and market the class and the types of emails we send out. And it requires, as I think Pete and Steve mentioned earlier, a teaching assistant, and not just one you get assigned, but one that's kind of self-sufficient and competent. And Jerry and I still laugh is that when I first started teaching for Jerry at Berkeley about 2 decades ago, we never mentioned that I could actually have a TA. And so I had to do all this stuff myself for the first 5 years until I discovered.
But we had to break you in, Steve. We had to train you.
I think it was a hazing ritual in the business school at Berkeley. So I kind of personally learned all the activities that a TA had to do as well. And I've now, as we've run these things, just can't overemphasize how important that is. And even if your school wouldn't pay for it, I have to tell you, I'd be investing in paying for one. The other surprise is because this was kind of open enrollment across at least all of Stanford affiliated alumni and students, the pool of students were uneven, and the results, though surprisingly, even though the students were uneven, you'll see later that the teams actually turned out to be actually surprisingly good. The other thing is for our programs, and in fact, I forgot to mention this when I was talking about common elements of all these classes, whether it's hacking for defense or oceans or recovery or Lean Launchpad, all our classes have mentors, and mentors are basically domain experts or ex-entrepreneurs or current entrepreneurs or VCs who want to give their time to support teams. And that's a critical element in making these team members feel supported, and also offloads the work you and the TAs have to do. But in this case, we found the mentors had to be more proactive and prescriptive because we were operating at a 5-day pace, boom, boom, boom. And the students really needed to get kind of direction and advice rapidly and with some urgency. And so the mentors pushed the students to be incredibly proactive. Next slide. And by the way, while we're talking about, or while we've all mentioned TAs, I should remind you all, and we'll put it in our resource page. Years ago, we wrote TA handbooks and mentor handbooks, and you know, those have taken on a life of their own, at least at Stanford. The TAs now kind of, you know, update it themselves every year. We open source that, and you all can have those available, and I'm sure you all have your version, but just in case, we'll stick those online. And so even though the pool of students were a bit uneven, the teams were mostly high quality, existing small businesses, new startups, as you would have expected in a Hacking for Recovery. Lots of telemedicine, a lot of COVID tracking apps, a lot of the things that were quite relevant, a lot of remote learning. The first class, I think, had 25 teams. The current session, we said we were going to run this 3 times. Our second session has 12 teams. We'll see what happens in our third session. The real surprise here is in 5 days, which I guess we shouldn't have been a surprise because I saw it every year at Columbia, teams make actual progress on product market fit. I mean, they actually, the ones that are engaged are building wireframes and like getting in front of customers and getting feedback, and it's just amazing. It's for some of them, you kind of go, whoa, 5 days, maybe, you know, maybe they don't even need a semester. But an impressive group, and we will post. First of all the Columbia 5-day classes are online. If any of you want to see examples of what happens at the end of 5 days, and we'll put these online as well. By the way, the record for number of interviews, at least in the Columbia 5-day class, is 163 customers in person. Though they did kind of cheat. This was a team building selling sports jerseys, so they went to Yankee Stadium. But they did talk to a lot of people. And then in this case, obviously, people were available. Just like everybody else noticed, customer discovery is actually easier, at least for first level interviews online. And a surprise for me, and I can't tell you what a surprise it was for the advocate of, you got to get out of the building, you got to see their pupils dilate, is, you know, yeah, you lose context of what else is on their desk and what's around their office, and whether they're in a strip mall or a 45th floor conference room, but you could do more of them, and you could be more efficient, and because you save travel time, you save gatekeeper time, you save a lot of time for first level interviews. I would now suggest, as Pete mentioned earlier, that a combination of first level interviews virtually and then physical trips to actually put MVPs in people's hands is probably how I would teach this class, even when we're able to go back to physical classroom. It's a big idea. And in fact, that's an experiment I'm going to run when we next hold our in-person class. Next slide. The bad, at least in this version, and again, it's the same I saw for the Columbia class, these were pickup teams, meaning most of them hadn't been working on this idea for years or even weeks. So they had the diverse level of commitment. The dropout rate during the 5 days wasn't extremely large, but it was large. I'd say we lost about 10 or 20% of the teams as they realized, oh, their bright idea wouldn't pass first level test, or they had different levels of commitment. And more importantly, now they're on different time zones. You know, we have teams literally in 24 time zones and team members in different time zones. There are no field trips, as everybody mentioned, student overload. We don't make all the teams here, all the presentations. We kind of divvy them up. We have we recruited a series of instructors besides the usual suspects. We've had Jerry, Heidi Rosen, and others, Tom Bedicare kind of joined. And so we were able to spread out the instructor load across anywhere from 3 to 5 teams rather than having to look at all of them. Another tip, this one I got from Tina Seelig here at Stanford, which I thought was a great addition and actually works quite well, is every new day that you meet, you actually put up a whiteboard on Zoom, and you let the students, you ask them, what was their takeaway from today's lecture? Or from yesterday, what did they learn outside the building? And you spend 5 or 10 minutes watching them as they put up the 1-sentence thing that they learned, and then they get to put check marks or hearts next to other people's comments about whether they thought that was valuable for them as well. And it's a good way to kind of get people in sync in a very short period of time. And I thank Tina for that, because I thought it was an incredibly useful tool. But unlike Hacking for Defense, right now there's no formal place or for the output to go. It was, and that's something that that we really need to think about. In summary, for at least assessment and recommendations, I think you all have probably experienced this or will, and just doubling down what other people have said, great TAs and intensive recruiting is critical. You know, getting students engaged and getting them mixing and helping them form teams has to be done manually. Where in the past, you might have been able to assume that the students were going to do this organically, and it ain't going to happen. You literally have to play matchmaker in building the teams a piece at a time. You have to set expectations, and the good news is, if anybody's interested, like the other stuff we do, we kind of open source all this stuff, the lectures, the video, the syllabus. It's available as a cookbook. Next slide. Alex, thank you. So summary, think of the 5-day class as an experiential version of what used to be a survey class for how to write a business plan. This is kind of a survey class for, you know, how to learn about Lean. It's kind of an introduction, an intensive introduction to kind of all the pieces of the methodology. The other thing is, and this is what Steve Auerbach at the University of Hawaii is going to use the class for, it could also be used to rally a specific community around a specific issue. And I found that just really interesting, so that Steve Auerbach was the first one to kind of recognize that, well, yes, Steve Blank, this is a nice survey class, but we have some real issues here in our community that we need to get smart people working on smart problems to help us get out of this hole. And this class could be one piece of a way to do that. And as everybody mentioned, I thought the class compared to the ones I was teaching in person, equal but different. It's engaged but not hands-on. And if I had to say, you know, if we were stuck doing this forever, is this a good substitute? I would probably tell you it's certainly good enough. And the tips and tricks that we learned, and I'm sure all of you have learned in teaching virtually, can make it even better. So thanks.
Great.
Jerry, back to you.
Yeah, you bet. Steve, I had a few great takeaways for myself from that one. And one of the things I love about Hacking for Recovery is it's so generalized, you know, but specifically relevant, because it focuses on recovery. And it opens to a broad audience, and it's generalized in terms of how people want to approach that. Grant, you're also, I just also want to recognize, I see the activity in the chat stream. I'm trying to keep up with it. There's a great parallel conversation going on and a lot of contributions. I just want to encourage people to continue to do that. It's fantastic. And if anybody knows how to copy a chat stream, I actually don't know how to do that. I hope we can preserve that. So Grant, you're helping us address, you know, societal change, and another, you know, we have COVID is a environmental change. Well, Black Lives Matter is certainly another environmental change or new awareness or heightened awareness. So tell us about the things you've learned in bringing that into focus. Grant, you may be on mute.
All right, there we go. All right, I couldn't unmute myself. The host had to unmute me. All right, good.
See,
Hey,
it's
hey,
contagious.
Grant,
It's not
Grant.
just me. Everybody else has this problem.
Well, and Grant, I know you believe this, but Black voices matter.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was gonna start protesting in here. All right, great. I appreciate that. All right, next slide, please. So I think, Jerry, that was a great lead-in. You know, the idea that we've had this shock to the system. So my colleagues have talked about the way that the pandemic will change the way that we operate. But to Jerry's point, the flip side of it is that it's brought into relief the impact of the ways that we have historically operated, right? We've allowed dramatic disparities in health, education, and wealth building to persist. And this shock has spawned the largest social movement perhaps in the country's history. So I want to talk a little bit about some projects that I'm working on that intersect with that. So one is GEM I4, which is creating entrepreneurial pathways for Black and Brown students, particularly in this LLP community. And then I want to talk a little bit about Black Learners Matter, which is kind of the front end of the funnel, right? Focused on educational equity. All right, next slide. All right, so just for everyone who doesn't know, I saw a few international shout outs in the chat. So NSF I-Corps is part of this Lean Launchpad community, perhaps one of the larger, if not the largest program. So it impacts about 250 teams per year, but focused on what we call lab to market, right? So looking to take things out of the university and commercialize them. What NSF terms now deep tech. So it impacts faculty and graduate students, et cetera. And it also has a significant commercial impact. So by its own accounting, the program has attracted $500 million of add-on funding for teams and companies that have gone through the program. So that's the good. The bad is their internal tracking shows poor engagement for people of color. So if we think about this as kind of an economic engine, the people in the university space or people of color have been left out. So to NSF's credit, the program manager's credit, they recognized this and said, hey, we want to implement a change. And so they invested in a partnership with GEM. And I'm going to come back to this idea of investing in a partnership a little bit later. But first, I want to talk about what GEM is. So GEM has a 40-year history of producing Black and Brown graduate students, masters and PhDs. So they have a network of somewhere around 4,000 alum currently, and their current fellows number somewhere between 800 and 1,000. So the program has grown tremendously over the years. And NSF looked at this as an opportunity to leverage kind of the GEM network and the GEM program in order to increase diversity in I-Corps, because GEM has a way that they go about recruiting, right? Something that they have developed in order to recruit, people of color into grad school, and NSF wanted to leverage that. And it involves in-person recruiting on campuses, right? So obviously that's a problem because when COVID-19 hits, you cannot do in-person recruiting. Next slide. So much like everything else, this program had to adapt to the reality of the online environment. And as everybody has mentioned, there are challenges and there are opportunities. So one of the opportunities, as people have mentioned, is that the cost of hosting an event has gone down. The cost of participating in an event has gone down. So in thinking about the seminars, which are half-day or more events, they can take that opportunity and chop them up into much smaller virtual events. So instead of one long seminars, we all have experienced a full day of Zoom is like a week of in-person meetings. What they've done, what we've done is broken these up. So we'll have a meetup separately. right? Something that will build community. A workshop that will introduce entrepreneurship and I-Corps to the community separately. A pep talk, right? Something that would bring Black and brown entrepreneurs in to talk about their experience, and then provide office hours, right? All with the hope of not just introducing I-Corps, but inspiring people to participate. That's part of the secret sauce that GEM was using for grad school. So the program started roughly 2 months ago, maybe a little less than that. So far, we've engaged 125 GEM fellows, placed several in I-Corps programs already. And so just to put that in perspective, over the 8-year history of the I-Corps program, so we're somewhere around 2,000 teams, we've been able to locate 2 fellows who have gone through I-Corps before. So this is early on, but making an impact. And the idea is to generate somewhere between 50 to 25 GEM teams per year. So that's, roughly in the 10% or slightly more range of teams. So this would have a significant impact on, kind of diversity in the I-Corps network. So we've still been able to maintain high levels of in-session engagement. Of course, we've been able to scale, as people are talking about, because people are not limited to a particular campus, and that's a big deal. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, I wanted to come back to this idea of investing in partnership, because I think that's what the core of the messaging is here. So, there's a saying, kind of diversity is being invited to the dance, inclusion is being invited to dance. But I want to take that a little bit differently, right? So diversity is being invited to the dance, inclusion is being on the planning committee, right? So that you have some agency in the process. And then equity is making sure that you're driving the outcomes, right? That people have attended and they're dancing, right? So that's where equity comes in. And to NSF's credit, the way they approach that is through that lens of partnership. It wasn't just saying, GEM, hey, give me your students. I think this is going to help I-Corps. It was recognizing that there are assets within GEM to invest in. And let's bring you to the table as a decision maker to form the program. And the investments that they're making are well spent, because it's building capacity that not only is placing teams, which is beneficial to I-Corps and to GEM, but it's also building an infrastructure to begin to evaluate broadly diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts across the network, right? So again, something that benefits both parties, only achieved through partnership. As everyone has mentioned, recruiting is going to be difficult in the pandemic. Recruiting underrepresented groups is going to be even more difficult. So this idea of finding partnership is going to really be critical. So I'm really encouraging everyone to think about your own efforts, right? And put it through that lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and figure out where you are. Are you just inviting people to the dance, or are you doing the other activities that push it further? Because I think that's the success of the program. The other thing I wanted to touch on here is the diverse perspectives. And in this case, it's not just diverse because the people are Black or brown. So I came from external to the GEM network. So we had an early meeting that brought together stakeholders. I then kind of hopped on to the project. So I came external to GEM. And I came with the idea that I guess most people who are involved in I-Corps would have come with, that, hey, you know what we're going to do? We're going to do some immersion in lean methodology really quickly, get them oriented to lean startup, and then we'll push them out into the I-Corps network. GEM, because of their lived experience with their fellows, said, no, we have a different approach to this. The way we do is we inspire, right? Then we inform. We don't just go and inform. So the format of the workshops are totally different than anything that's being run in the I-Corps network. And that matters, right? So that matters. So again, coming to it and really trying to understand what assets people allow you to build partnership. And so I want to make sure that message came through. And I will share with everyone, yes, the remote environment is challenging, just like everyone has said, but there are opportunities for you to leverage, things that allow you to scale. And again, if you find the right partners in the online environment, they have relationships that can scale, right? Because it lowers the cost, both to hosting events and participating in events. All right, so that's the core piece that I wanted to touch on for the LLP community. Now I want to talk about something slightly different, but also important. Next slide. So, so again, as I mentioned, this is kind of the beginning of the pipeline, right? So this is what feeds all of our programs. Whether you're an educator or a practitioner, right, it relies on people having a good, solid, fundamental education. So when the pandemic hit, a business partner and I said, hey, you know, we wonder kind of what impact this is having on, you know, educators and administrators. And to the earlier point, does this shock provide opportunities for innovation? So we started off and did some discovery calls just to understand, hey, what's the challenges of teaching in the COVID environment? I can say I was completely shocked, right? I was completely shocked that teaching as I would have thought it was not happening, right? Was not happening. In my mind, there was a bunch of synchronous instruction happening throughout the day. Maybe it wasn't all day, but in and out in sections. What we found, and particularly in the larger school districts, is that synchronous education was not happening at all. So because you had students who didn't have access to internet, didn't have access to machines, teachers who were concerned about what they might see, or teachers unions to be maybe more specific, who were concerned about what teachers might see in the background, they had all but banned synchronous instruction. So you can imagine that we have persistent gaps in educational performance in the best of times. In the worst of times, those things are only going to grow. And so that issue of educational equity drove us to form this Black Learners Matter initiative. Next slide, please. So discovery is still ongoing. So I'm not here to say, hey, we found all of these problems and here are the solutions. We're still searching for problems and solutions. So we've held a couple of webinars in addition to our discovery calls to begin to build community and to begin exploring the problem and solution space. But you know, in the spirit of the partnership that I identified with I-Corps and GEM, really what we're looking for are people who are interested in this problem and recognize those closest to the problem have something valuable to contribute. So if you're interested in supporting people who have solutions to the problem, and you're all practitioners in some way, maybe you run accelerators, if you have people who are invested in those problems, please direct them to Black Learners Matter. What we're trying to do is begin to catalog solutions. If you're not a solution developer, but you're interested in a true spirit of partnership, and you know, so my business partner says, well, you know, partnership comes in different forms, right? So it's kind of three C's, right? So it could be that you care. It could be capital, right? Or it could be contracts. So if you think that you can support any of the solution providers in that way, please, again, Black Learners Matter, add yourself to the partners page, because we're also looking for allies. Again, don't have solutions, but I think this is an important problem that we should all tackle, right? Given the tool set that we have, to Steve's prior presentation, we should use that tool set to solve some of these challenging problems. All right, and with that, I'm done. Thank you.
You're not done. You're just getting started, Grant. I know you're not done. Yeah, I just want to share with you that I know while you were sharing with us, you couldn't be looking at the chat, of course. But I got to tell you, there's a lot of resonance for what you were saying in the chat stream. People are sharing resources and lists of research. The idea that you meant that you know, inclusion means you know, your definition of inclusion is agency and bringing people into leadership. That really resonated. And a lot of us out here were saying, yeah, inspire first. That's a lesson we all can learn. And so sometimes that's our mission, is to bring inspiration and then the practitioner skills along with that inspiration. With that, Alex, you're going to help us see from your seat in Switzerland. You know, we have a lot of colleagues from all over. We have colleagues online from Australia. We have colleagues online from India. We have colleagues online from, I was making a list that goes very long. You know, so this global perspective, this global approach, and actually going virtual at scale that you do is very important to us. So please share.
Thanks, Jerry. So I hope you can all hear me fine.
We do.
So I am just quickly going to share a little bit about the 3 big lessons, if you want, that we learned from going from physical kind of workshops to virtual ones. But I want to start with something that I think is incredibly important for physical and virtual, is this analogy. Like when we teach entrepreneurship and, you know, we need to get out of the building, you don't want a doctor to kind of start snippeting around on you, a surgeon who's never practiced, right? But you also don't want a doctor who's going to work on you who has never learned the theory. So I will go a little bit into the concepts and how to teach those interactively, because I think the Lean Launchpad class has a lot on getting out of the building as well. But so I'm going to make 3 points. The first one is really about engaging exercise. I'm going to talk about that one most. How do you actually make things engaging in a virtual space? So I'll give you 3 real examples, okay? So the first interactivity is simply asking, you know, a question. So I'll give you the case here. I ask people, you know, what did all these 3 companies have in common? You know, what's keeping them ahead of competition? And you ask people to answer in the chat windows. That's the first form of activity. You get people to do something, to engage, okay? Now, I use this to teach the business model pattern of gravity creators. So this is something, you know, one of many patterns that students should start to know to create better business models around what they're learning in the field from customer discovery and customer development interviews. So in this case, these 3 companies, they all added switching costs to their business model. So that's a very simple, you know, pattern, gravity creators, coming from our last book. This is a way to lock in customers, okay? So this is the theory part. You know, you need a great value proposition for customer segments, but this value proposition locks in customers to increase lifetime value. Okay, so that's the theory. Now, how do we make this interactive? I'll give you an example. So I use an old example here, the iPod, and then ask students, how would they apply this business model pattern to the iPod? And here's where you make it interactive, where you ask them, okay, here's the business model canvas. Here are the 6 business model building blocks that you need to put into the right spot. So all you need to ask students to do is take these letters here, these business model building blocks, and add them to the right spot. So in this case, iPod, you know, 1,000 songs in a pocket, that would go here. So you ask them to write down the sequence of letters by matching letters and numbers, okay? So simple, you ask them to do this once you've taught the theory. So I'm not going to go deep into the theory. I'm not going to get you to do the exercise, but I'm showing you how you can make it interactive. Once you get them to do that, you give them 3 minutes online. It's kind of awkward to be silent for 3 minutes, but the students are working individually. It's very powerful. So you give them the first and then ask them to make this sequence, and then you give them the answer. So in this case, the sequence is A, it goes into block 1, D goes into block 2, etc. And then you start explaining. So this is for the customer segment of mass markets. You're able to lock in the customers with switching costs, which creates recurring revenues. And then you have the last 2 building blocks, the channels, and the key resources required. So simply by using letters and numbers, you can mix up a class. And this is incredibly important if you want to keep the class dynamics you know, really interesting, and you want students to not log out and go do email and stuff, okay? So that's the simplest form, easy to do. But then we went a level further and said, well, it's not enough when people work alone, we want them to work together. So here's a second exercise. We asked them to map out Google's business model for search advertising, okay? So instead of just giving them a canvas or asking them to do this, you know, on a piece of paper, which we could, we tell them to go to a pre-prepared workspace. So we use Strategizer for this. You could use Miro or Murally, whatever you want. And we have there a pre-prepared workspace where we have a business model canvas, And we have the building blocks. So like before here, the building blocks of the business model for Google for search advertising. And we asked them to simply pull virtually these building blocks down here. And they do that in the workspace, because after we explain this exercise, we tell them, okay, now we throw them into Zoom groups, actually in groups of 3, because if one gets lost in cyberspace, you'll still have 2 people working. And for about 6 minutes, they can do this exercise. So this is an important different exercise from the letter one, because they actually do something in groups of 2. So the energy level is even higher because they collaborate together, okay? And then after that, we start explaining the business model for Google, but that's not the point here. Now, the last one that I want to show you is from the whole customer discovery space. So after we've taught them a whole series of business model experiments, how they can test their business models, we ask them, once we give them 5 different experiments, and I'll show you this in a second, to create the best sequence. Which experiment would they start with? Which one would they do second, third, fourth, and fifth? So here, I give them the 5 different experiments, okay? So again, they have a sequence, A, B, C, D, E, and of course we explained how do you do customer discovery interviews, how can you use discussion forums to get evidence, how do you do this one, card sorting, speedboat, PDF brochures, how can you use all of these to test? But the question was, remember, what is the best sequence? So you start with a cheap experiment and you work towards a more sophisticated one. So I give them 2 minutes to do this. You see the timer up there going on, and they need to come up with a sequence and an argument why they would start with one and then go to the second, third, fourth, and fifth. And then I show them the correct sequence that I would use or that we would use, and we give them an explanation. So telling them they should start with discussion forums because that's pre-existing stuff. Then they could go to discovery, interviews because they can use what they found in the forums. Then they can start prioritizing pains with this so-called speedboat exercise, and then start to look at the features. Again, another prioritizing experiment. And then the 5th experiment, they would go and show a PDF brochure. And you can do all of these you can do in the virtual space. It's extremely powerful to teach them this in an interactive way because they had to think about it. So you kept the class interactive. They did it virtually before they actually go into the real world to do that. So that's 3 different types of exercises to keep your classes interactive. Second big point that we actually did wrong first is we didn't realize how important it is to design networking activities, to not just let them happen. Because in the physical world, they just happen, right? Because people are in class or in coffee break, etc. So what we did first, which was wrong, we thought they would go on Slack and do networking before the class. Didn't really work very well, so they complained and said we wanted networking during the class. So we started using Zoom to do breakout rooms to network during class, and we designed different types of networking. And it's important to find a tool that will allow you to do breakout rooms, because not all tools like Zoom do this. Zoom has its weaknesses, but the powerful thing is you can do breakout rooms, which we're going to do later on, right? So the last one that we took incredibly seriously, which sounds a little bit like a gimmick, but I like, showing the foundations and the things we really believe in, is because we're using a lot of different technological tools and we want students to use them well, we carefully onboard all of the students with videos, with that kind of a white glove service. We handhold them if they're lost before the class. So when you start the class, everybody's on their top game. So the technology stack we kind of used was Slack for communication pre, during, post class. You can use up obviously whatever you want, worked for us. For the onboarding, where we show videos and where we're going to get them to do the exercises as I showed you before, we use Strategizer. You can use Miro or Murally as well. Extremely important because you want to keep the class interactive, and you in fact want them to track the evidence online afterwards while you're running the class over a semester. And the third one, again, we use Zoom for very particular reason, because you can do breakout rooms. Without the breakout rooms, we couldn't make our class as interactive. Okay, since my time is up, I'm just going to give you one thing. You're going to get this by email after the class. For you, this was Steve Blank's idea. We designed a poster for you with all of the experiments that we came up with in our Testing Business Ideas book, the experiment library, which you will be able to download. Cool kind of thing for students to look at all of the different types of experiments that you could do beyond the interview. Now, what we haven't done, this is one task we're working on now, is to kind of point out which one of these experiments can be really well done in the COVID-19 kind of remote testing environment. And with that, I'll hand back over to Jerry.
Wow, Alex, that was a master class. And in 10 minutes, that was magic. Thank you very much. I'm sure we'd all like to hear much more. So now it's our chance to share some questions. Alex Gallo is going to help me pick out questions from the chat stream. Although I'm going to start with, I'm actually going to call out a name, and if that person, we'll see if this can work. If that person can speak up and unmute themselves. I don't know that we centrally can allow you to do that, but I'd actually like you to ask your own question. So, Chris McCleary, are you there? Can you speak to us and tell us about what you wanted to know from Steve Weinstein about what he means by, departmental juice? You want to ask that question yourself?
I gave people the ability to unmute themselves.
Okay, good.
Thank you, Jerry. This is a bit, I'm feeling like I've been cold called.
You have.
I actually did get helpful responses to that in the chat. So I'm going to, it's been answered. Thank you.
Oh, well, Steve, I'm going to ask you. Tell me how you got.
So I would actually.
Some of us don't have the pull you have.
So I would actually say there were two cases. One, it's really just my own discovery process of finding the person who felt that there was a need in the university, and getting somebody who actually has the ability to get a class on the curriculum, really wants a new kind of program, and is able to kind of rally the forces. I mean, if Radhika is still online, I will tell her it's how she did it and was capable of doing it, and I saw she answered a little bit in the chat. Right?
Julian. Oh, there you are, Radhika.
Yeah, I think it really comes down to you need to find a couple of folks who are in the know in the university. So I found someone who understood who might be interested at UC Santa Cruz. And then we brought them together and sold it. And it's like Steve says, you really need someone who's very enthusiastic about it. And the professor we found totally believed in entrepreneurship, was trying to create that system around it. In fact, the program she created had a lot of that in it. And so that really helped.
That's fantastic. Julian, and I didn't jot down your last name, there's so much was happening, but you asked a question about creating prototypes. Can you speak up, please?
Sure, thank you very much, Jerry. One of the difficulties that I have been finding when running these classes is how do you create those physical rough prototypes? Yes, we can create wireframes and all that, but the building and making those prototypes that we all love. Has anybody found a way how to use maybe 3D games or something online that we can bring when the teams are working in small teams, in breakout rooms, virtual Legos, or I don't know. I mean, is there anything out there that they can put together virtually?
It's interesting. I've seen personally, you mentioned Legos. I've seen Legos used in the real world for quick prototyping, but I've never seen virtual Legos. Does anybody from the speaking faculty, from the organizers, have any recommendations about virtual prototyping? Well, it looks like a place where we all are struggling then in how to have people collectively virtually prototype. Ashley Aitken, you raised a different question, which I've encountered myself, about the corporate environment. Would you speak to that, please? Ashley Aitken.
Yes, hello everyone. I was just asking about the industry situation. How do these situation transfer to industry training, where many people think they're doing lean and understand customer development, when really the basics are sometimes what's missing?
Jim Hornthal, I see you there, and I know you've done a lot of work in the corporate space. What do you do when you engage in a corporate environment where they think they know what they're doing, but they don't?
Thanks, Jerry. I think one of the things interesting in the corporate environment is it's not just a episodic use of a synchronous cohort. It's more of a chronic need. And so what we found in the corporates that have had the most success is they have mentors from the first cohort helping the second cohort and so on. And that wisdom, that learning, those early scar tissues rapidly improve their performance. Metrics like the pivot ratio, which we'll talk about in my breakout room, about how many times you try to be wrong before you're right. And I think the best thing is the first one is horribly painful. I haven't found a way to make it less painful. Second one's better, and by the time they hit their third cohort and it's a chronic use, they can go back and pull data from all the prior experiments and evidence, and that is the only Band-Aid, if you will, or curative process that we found that works consistently in larger use cases where, in fact, the body of evidence and data is scalable and is valuable.
Thanks for catching that hot ball. Laura Bailey, would you speak to your comment here? Because you actually have an idea about the virtual prototyping.
Yeah, are you able to hear me okay?
We absolutely can.
Okay, so I have colleagues who send out physical prototyping kits. So it requires quite a bit of legwork and you're relying on the postal service. But these are things like Arduino, other types of things where the hardware is really critical to the prototyping aspect. In the program I teach in, students will do 3D modeling and VR as a way to kind of play around with spatial concepts. It's not perfect and definitely requires a whole new level of collaboration, but it does the trick.
Fantastic. Good thoughts. I want to turn back to the speaking panel again and ask for any reactions or closing comments, because we're going to quickly now move. We have 2 minutes, and then we're going to move into our subgroups. So any comments from Grant, Pete, Steve, in terms of as we move that transition?
Jerry, can I add one point to the physical prototyping? So while I completely agree physical prototyping is important, there's also a risk that people then go off and build stuff, and feasibility risk is actually the least important, I would say, in many cases at the beginning. So, you know, just using PDF documents, spec sheets is extremely powerful to learn from customers. They don't, you know, of course at one point they need to see it, but you put a spec sheet in front of a customer, potential customer, they will react very, very strongly, and you can make it look very real. So I think there's always a risk, you know, of going off and wanting to build stuff. You don't need to. And so in the virtual space, you're almost forced towards better behavior. So it's actually pretty good, because then students will use PDFs and spec sheets and will actually get better data much faster because they won't build stuff.
And I'm going to grab that as a great transition comment, Alex, is what you're saying is, how can we not look at the challenges necessarily, but the opportunities of being in the virtual space? How does the virtual space actually work to an advantage? And a lot of what I've heard from our colleagues speaking this morning is that they found that, in fact, it's different, but not necessarily worse in every regard. It's just some things are actually better. And I think that's what we need to lean into. Certainly we have challenges, and that's what we're going to discuss in our groups. What my transition comment to the instruction to the groups is, the groups may be fairly large, we were going to have about 22 groups, I believe. And there may be 20 or so people in the room. With mutual respect, I think we can still have a lively conversation. There's going to be a burden on the moderators. Alex, would you put up the moderator slide, please, with all the names?
Yes, we'll do.
And so I just want to give respect and some call out to these folks who've volunteered for this. And you have a real challenge. So let's help them by being proactive. Let's help them by being clear in our messaging and sharing. So we all know how to do that. We're now going to transition the mechanics of this. Alex, do you want to talk us through the mechanics of how this is going to happen?
Yes, absolutely. So what's going to happen is everybody's going to move to their breakout rooms. The first part of the session is each breakout room will have a moderator. We'll go through those who have selected or self-selected to do these virtual poster sessions, and they'll spend time explaining that. And then the moderator will go through a series of questions that you see here on the screen, from what are your biggest challenges down to are there scalable solutions? And then the moderator will summarize the group's findings, and then we will come back together as a large group, and each breakout room moderator will share their findings from their sub-session.
And Alex, my understanding of the mechanics is that we're automatically going to be dropped into rooms. We don't need to leave. We don't need to go anywhere. We just need to sit tight.
Correct. You'll just be asked to join the room and you hit join.
Yeah, thank you. That's what I needed to know. Perfect. So thank you very much. It's 11:31. We're going to rejoin as an entire group exactly at, checking my schedule, 12:10 my time, 3:10 East Coast. My time is West Coast. So please be active and contributive, and this is our chance to capture from you your best learnings. Well, I want to welcome everybody back, and this is going to be a real. Had the opportunity to drop in on a number of the sessions, and you know, those were pretty good discussions. So the session leaders now have a challenge of taking a minute, literally maybe 90 seconds, and sharing you know, lessons learned. We know how to do this, and I'm going to work right down the list that's on the screen, so you can see your name. Tom, you have the misfortune of being the first name in the upper left. We're going from Tom to Chris to Phil to Jim to Mike to Bob. We're going to go right down, and then over to to Jim and Victoria and Todd, and right down that side. So you know where you are, and you can begin to prepare your comments. Tom, you've had no time to prepare your comments. Go for it.
Hey, we had a fantastic discussion, and one of the great things was the similar experiences everyone is having. And I'd say the thing that people miss most are the personal connections and the spontaneous interactions and the bumping into people in the hallway. And I don't know that we had a solution for that, but that was the thing that people missed most. And the thing that came up most frequently as gained was the availability that everybody has. Since we're not traveling and we're all sheltering in place, mentors are easier to find, are more willing to give time to teams and classes. So that was a big plus. Lots of little things like just the names on Zoom help people be able to call out to students. Someone made a suggestion to do direct chat messages to students to engage them. Just trying to find ways to have group activities and teamwork. Those are some of the highlights, and I'll pass it on to Chris.
Cool. Go for it, Chris.
Wow, that was fast. So I'll go down these quickly so that I capture them all. Some people experience difficulty with office hours for teams in general on Zoom technology. Just it's a function of getting used to the technology that we're using going forward. A lot of our professors said that prep work prior to the first class, and it was mentioned in your discussions, one of the classes, is that loading people up with the stuff, videos and things to read and watch prior to showing up on day one seems to help out quite a bit. I think that helps out quite a bit if you're teaching in person or not. Slack and Zoom worked really well together as sort of a tech stack for getting the class done. Interesting point that public funders of various classes and private funders of various classes, public funders tend to wait and see how things will shake out before they continue to fund. Private funders are like, chop, chop, let's go, which I think is a very good point. One thing that was asked for was, and I can't do it today, but perhaps as a follow-up email, is really get people involved in what are the actual recruiting methods that people are using. Not that it's a heavy lift, not that it's hard, but what are people actually doing in order to help recruiting, and share that across the community. Interesting, online learning, particularly keep everything live. Don't use recordings of previous sessions for your next session. Keeping it live matters an awful lot to keeping the engagement going on. Excuse me. One-on-one interaction when possible, whether it's via Zoom or some other way, really makes a difference. As this whole session today is about, being able to work with, we can't just transfer everything we did in person to online. A general thought from everyone. Not all universities have had instructional lessons for professors who are now teaching online. I know we have it at Georgetown, but I found out that lots of universities don't, so they either have to reach out for it or it doesn't exist. Never cancel the course, make it work somehow. We shouldn't have people spend a bunch of resources in prep and to say, it's too hard, we're not gonna do it. Never cancel. Unique constituencies, such as rural constituencies and dense urban populations, may not have the access to resources for online learning, whereas before it was they showing up into a classroom. So I think one mention was in New Mexico, the Navajo population may not. And then of course the point was brought up, hey, there's a whole bunch of people in New York City who don't have the bandwidth at home or tools in order to be involved in the instruction. And that's a bigger problem that we should probably talk about and think about how we might solve. And then of course, someone said, the final thing is someone asked, if this is, we're transitioning to online and people are changing their lives, does that reduce the number of customer discovery interviews that we should be doing? My response, well, as someone who's been flogged by Steve and Pete and Joe and everyone, is that you got to do as many interviews as you can do all the time in order to get to your next MVP. Remarkably, some people who are teaching forward classes can extend to 5 or 6 weeks. They have that flexibility. But at a university like ours, it's a 14-week semester. There is no extension. You're done when you're done. So, so that I'll leave it at that. That's our takeaway.
Thank you very much, Chris. That was a fire hose.
Sorry.
Philip?
Yes, let me just go on mute. That's a tough act to follow, Chris. Thank you. So, one of the things that, we discussed was that what happened 3 months ago is very different from, what we're doing now. And that is that, there has been a behavior change. People are used to using the Zoom and the technologies. And so, there is a new normal that has been established. Certainly, in terms of the prep work, that was emphasized as well in terms of having a success. One of the things for the courses that have sort of lab type courses was a side benefit that came out of that was that the computer simulations actually led to, when they went into, for example, a competition, the computer simulations that each of the individuals did versus having to work together in the lab actually made for better outcomes on that. And then, don't schedule in the morning. The students, students, if you can, don't schedule courses in the morning because their sleep habits are different right now as they're living at home. From a technology perspective, one of the things that I had not heard, which came through, was that students have they're really liking and using technology. It's a game platform called Discord. They find that works actually better than Zoom. I'm not familiar with it, but I think it's something that should be, checked into as another tool to provide to students. So thank you.
Good, thank you very much. Jim.
Yeah, thanks, Jerry. I think one of the things the whole lean paradigm gave us all, even pre-COVID, was we inverted the students ask a question, the teachers have the answer, and now it's the opposite, right? The teachers ask the questions, the students have to go find the answer. And when we're all together in a classroom, the activity and engagement metrics are kind of understandable. You know who's doing the work, you know who's showing up, and it's harder online. So the things that we talked about very briefly in the poster session was a new activity metric that we've adopted, the pivot ratio. How many interviews have you done and how many invalidations have you done? And that's a clear metric if you're off the rails or on the rails. But more importantly, the participation. 15% of our grade is participation. And while peers can post a comment, is it a good comment? So we started this peer leaderboard. And what we look at is each team, we have 8 teams, 32 students, which means 28 are watching you present. We expect 28 comments, but which were the best comments? So if Jerry, Steve, and I were a team, we'd look at the 28 and decide which were the 3 best. And we post every class the leaderboard. Whose comments really made sense? Not nice font, like the logo, you have a typo on slide 6, but useful. And I think that makes it a little bit easier in this distributed virtual world to know who's really showing up and really doing the job of class participation. We talked about also with the semester, we got the benefit of more than 10 weeks. We can, Jerry leads off our class with a brilliant customer discovery workshop. Before we even get out of the building, like, what does that mean? We've got to polish the right side of the canvas. If you don't have desirability, yes, we'll still teach you about feasibility and viability, but that's really product market fit stuff. So we get the benefit in the semester world of having breathing time. Online fatigue was a universal problem. People talked about how do you break it up? Obviously, a little break in the middle is one thing, but more variety. Pete was in our session, and hacking for the fences set a bar others can only aspire to. And Steve Blank mentioned before about great speakers. When Condi Rice comes, people show up, but it was also relevant. It wasn't just show and tell smart speakers. And I think all of us have alumni and networks we can draw from. And I think the more we can do that, the better. And the last thing I'll say is when Jerry and Steve got this thing started working with VentureWell, it was train the trainers, teach the teachers. Well, we got to get the TAs learned. Valeria is an example of a woman who's awesome at Stanford. She could run a course teaching other people how to be a TA in this digital world. And I think giving that scale and leverage of knowledge about how to be a great TA will help us be more successful, reaching our students, teaching the curriculum, and getting great results. So I think that, be careful with your speakers. They may not be what you think, but I think that it was a great group. We're all struggling with online fatigue. And with that said, I'm going to drink my coffee and shut up. Thanks, Jerry.
It sounds like you already drank your coffee. Thanks, Jim. Hey, Mike, your ball. Mike Morris.
Yes, I'm. So I quickly want to just give everyone sort of our discussion. We had an interesting poster by one of our panel members who talked about the importance of using project management tools for course planning, especially when you're doing it virtually. And that's not for your students and your teams, that's for you as a faculty member, and especially if you have support members and such. We got into a long discussion around tools, and I just wanted to highlight some of the tools and recommendations that some of the faculty in my group highlighted. One was Top Hat. Another was, using a LinkedIn group for creating a specific LinkedIn group for the class so that the students can get to know each other and also use that for team formation. Virtual sticky notes, Lucidchart was highlighted as a potential tool there. Slido, Kahoot for quizzes, and Lambda School was highlighted as a great resource for giving people the ability to learn technical skills that they need to support their teams. So those were, I just summarized those because they came up, and a number of them I was not familiar with. Another part of our discussion talked about how difficult it is to create group cohesion with a classroom virtually. Meaning the class as a whole, not the individual group, not the individual teams, startup teams within the class. And that really was something that got highlighted by a number of our folks that they haven't figured out how to get around yet. Even though when we were teaching in this past semester or quarter, we were dealing with social issues and everything else and trying to bring those into the class, it just seemed harder to do that, at least some of the faculty highlighted, than when it was when everyone was live. One of our other participants highlighted how the culture and the process to sort of create culture of revenue generating businesses in a university is very slow, and he is finding that virtual is making that much harder. It's just harder to sort of be, when you're the faculty member or instructor of practice who's trying to drive that, it's harder to do. And then we had one last random suggestion that someone had, which was, because we talked a little bit about how do you ensure there's attention over the entire class, and how many people are, have their Zoom up but are not actually in front of their Zoom, because if you're not requiring them to have cameras on, which is a separate discussion. And one of our faculty suggested that, and this is myself, what I do is I end the class randomly, and then I see how quickly everyone ends off. And at least in one class, I noticed there were 3 or 4 people who just were still there, but they weren't really there. They just had their Zoom up, but they weren't really participating. So if you have that flexibility in your class at random times, you can get a sense who's actively engaging or not engaging. Those were the key things we discussed. Thank you.
Super. That's super, Mike. I know everybody's sensitive to keeping the time, so please stay sensitive to that. Where this is great feedback. There's also great discussion still going on in the chat stream, and we're going to capture it all. So go for it, Bob. Bob Dorff, you're up, and you're muted.
I have to get off mute. Okay, thank you, Jerry, and thanks everyone. Lots of good ideas flying around. I'm going to try not to repeat the problems and issues so many have talked about already. One thing that came up was trying to break the homework into shorter bites, smaller sprints, so that there's more accountability and more interaction, whether it's in office hours or in work group sessions or whatever. The second is to be guarded with how readily you give out your office hour time. And the trick that I used in particular is, when you have done these 2 or 3 things, reach out to me and you'll earn an hour or a half hour or whatever of my time. One of the, I think this was from James Madison University, I may have that wrong, an interesting way to jumpstart a digital customer discovery conversation. The students have to first create a 4-panel graphic novel that says, this is what we want to talk about. This is the problem I want to discuss. These are the things I want to cover. Let's get started. And they have to present that to the class and get it approved and edited and use it to open up each, Zoom conversation to get to the point more quickly in those calls. I thought that was particularly clever. Another one, which I only heard a whisper of before, is resource training for instructors, especially us older ones. What is this Zoom thing and that little mute button down in the corner? And how do I break them out into, chat groups and so on and so forth? And a number of schools have had some real success, particularly for the schools populated more with older Luddite types, getting them comfortable doing all this sort of stuff. Number of ideas around building a better sense of community among your classmates with happy hours and things like that. In London, they're doing virtual insanities instead of happy hours, just sort of a cute sort of play on words. And the other interesting thing that came out is introverts now have a voice for the first time. They don't have to speak up. They can let their fingers do the talking. And so it's encouraging more people to be more engaged
Great insights.
in the conversation.
Great insights. Thank you very much, Bob. Naeem.
So in our group, we also talked about quite a bit about asynchronous classroom, because some people have gone forced to asynchronous. So we talked about breaking the lectures into 8 to 15 minute sections, 8 to 15 minutes interval. That seems to work well. And also have an open Zoom office hours when people can drop in. So fixed announce the open Zoom office hours, that was effective. One other thing which was mentioned, that people gave higher quality comments on others' presentation if they could watch it in video. So people had 8 minutes to record their presentation, coming back to the classroom asynchronously. Then other teams had a few days when they can provide comment. Since in the classroom, people are more nervous about what they're going to say. They're not listening as well. By making it asynchronous in video, the quality of comments from other teams was much higher.
Yeah, I hate to interject, but that would also kill the instructor's ability to give live reactions to the presentation.
Sure. But they were dealing with the asynchronous classroom, so this was the issue. But then what happened was the instructor did provide feedback, but it was asynchronously provided. Other thing they did was all the comments received, they'll highlight the top 3 comments. A team who received the comment will say, these 3 comments were most useful. Yeah. And that allowed people to sort of improve the quality of comments. Other thing we discussed was what tools were effective. One tool which was mentioned for recording videos is Loom, like L as in lucky, OOM. So that was free, convenient, and easy to record videos so they could be shared. And yeah, that's good enough.
Thank you very much. Dave. Dave Chapman, you're up.
So things get easier and quicker as we get repetition. So in our group, we certainly echo some of the things that have come out. We echo Jim Horthill's comments on the importance of TAs, particularly in the context of budgetary challenges that we see at times. Value our TAs, they're essential in supporting online. We echo Michael's comments on the issues about presence or lack thereof when just faced with a sea of names and no videos, and how we might deal with that. New contributions, we talked a little bit about how much we valued Alex Osterwalder's presentation today of actionable practical tools that you could actually pick up and take away and learn and use, and maybe there's scope for a repository for those, maybe on the Slack channel somewhere.
There will be.
Things you can actually use. Stanford in the past has done a brilliant job on this, but others out there to share. There was also a discussion got truncated. We had people who were particularly interested in female entrepreneurship and whether there was scope for communities of practice to be kind of coalesced out of the participants here. That's through the Slack channel to allow people to meet like-minded folk. And that lots of other things which we'll summarize in the slide, but many of them repeating things that are.
Thank you very much, Dave. And just a personal comment, Ichaso says hello.
Thank you.
I don't have a chance to say that often. Paul Fox from Barcelona.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Jerry. So talking a little bit about challenges, we had a lot of the same ones that everybody had as we go down the list. I'm sure this will happen. But I don't think anybody's really talked about the student connectivity issues, but also professor connectivity issues. We used Blackboard Collaborate, and it's kind of a bandwidth hog, and so Zoom is more agile, Teams is more agile, but that was a problem a lot of times. Professors falling back to long lectures rather than doing more interactive discussion in class, partly because they didn't know the tools, or they couldn't see who was talking, or because they couldn't see the chat, especially when sharing the screen. Exams, I don't know if anybody actually does exams these days, but we had a big issue with this across the university. I replaced exams with individual reflections, and it worked so much better than exams that I'm not going back. just to find out who was actually doing the work and who understood what we were doing. Some issues that things took more planning. So I found myself kind of creating more templates, and because what you realize once you do your first breakout room is once they're in the breakout rooms, they're gone. You can't give them anything else. So the idea that you have to actually make sure that they know exactly what they're supposed to do once they're in there, so they're not kind of constantly calling you, and then you could kind of bounce around between them. And the onboarding of professors, so professors' difficulty with the tools is another challenge. One thing that's not, it wasn't on the questions, but some people kind of commented on, is we were really surprised, and I'm sure a lot of you guys share this, which is how effective you can be online compared to what we thought it would be like before doing this. I was telling people in the group that we did a hackathon that I just found on LinkedIn with a VC in London, and we had over 200 participants in 3 time zones using Slack, Google Docs, and also Vima, which is a Finnish ideation tool. And then we went to a next phase, and I mentored a team, and they're continuing. Now the investor said, they said nobody will give you money if you've never met each other in person, which is a challenge. Now they have people in 3 time zones actually trying to create something, but it was a great experience, and it was my first experience with Zoom. Other solutions that we came up with: checking discussion boards, so using this asynchronous mode as well, checking discussion boards frequently, sending reminders, also you could see when students were logged in and see how much time they spent. This also was part of engagement and seeing participation. I noticed that some people got more engaged online than they actually were in the classroom. So for some introverted students, this was positive. And I used a lot of kind of smaller deliverables and more frequent ones, and giving students feedback. And so kind of maximizing the amount of feedback they got from different places. I used a lot of peer feedback. I don't know if you guys have done this, but it helps the professor a lot to kind of frees you up to go around. So
Thank you very much, Paul. Paul, okay, I'm going to have to, I really appreciate that. Thank you. Phil,
thank you.
From Venturewell.
Hi, everybody. We had a great discussion in our group. We did talk about a number of the things that have come up and some interesting team tools and things that have not been mentioned. Just to start there, one that was talked about was nearpod.com, and some interesting ways of using existing LMS systems like Canvas. And there was, just to sort of give a +1 to the multiple tools and the need to kind of do that, because none of the existing single tools really work in full by itself, which leads to some of the challenges. The first being the sort of cognitive load, and that's been talked about a little bit, but the solution space that we went to was how you can get people to help you with that process, even if they are not necessarily technical or know anything about what you're talking about, sort of dragging people in just to change the slides and so forth. We did talk a bit about the bandwidth issue. So, I think that's actually more ubiquitous than you might think, in terms of even in a situation where people theoretically have bandwidth, like living in a dorm on campus. If you have a bunch of students in a pod living together and they all go online virtually at the same time, it causes problems. So anticipating that, figuring out how to take things offline that are particularly bandwidth hogs. The other thing that we talked about, which I thought was probably a common challenge, is where there is an expectation of a prototype, how to address that. I don't think there was a single solution, but there was a lot of enthusiasm for requiring it to be done anyway and allowing people to be creative about how they solve for some of the challenges, whether it's enabling them to get access to fab resources or requiring them to do mock-ups or even to build the prototype as best they can. And I'll close with a couple things. The exhortations and lessons learned. The first was, giving the students and yourself the space to be creative about your solutions, and you'll probably be surprised about what results. Hopefully those are mostly happy surprises, but when they're not, give yourself permission to fail in advance and take the risk that you need to keep things rolling. I'll stop there.
Great messages, Phil. Stephanie Maris from UCSF. Okay, well, let Stephanie catch up. Jim.
Hi, so our group identified 6 different challenges, but I'm only going to talk about the ones that I haven't really heard as much about. One challenge that was raised was the bureaucratic issues that we're kind of facing now. One member said that their instructor contracts only allow them to hire, don't allow them to hire people for online teaching, for example. With my group, we are having issues with I-Corps grants and things like that. So maybe there's some way that we can also talk about some of those bureaucratic issues. Another issue was around some recruitment. I haven't heard too much about that, but how do we continue to recruit when you're not running into each other on campus? How do you don't have posters and things like that. And the third one I thought that I haven't heard as much about is like, how do we communicate the course expectations? I mean, the students are coming in expecting to do customer discovery interviews, but and if they've heard of it before, they're like, well, how do we do that without actually talking to people? But what people wanted to talk mostly about was engagement of the students when you're doing the online teaching. And I think that we broke it down into 4 different ways, methodologies. One is, well, different ways of using chat. One of the participants talked about how they use this chat, what they call chat bombing. Mute that person. Chat bombing, and we also,
Thank you. Go ahead, Jim. You have to unmute yourself.
All right. So I don't know what I dropped out, but we used, there was a talk about chat bombing as a technique, which is where you tell the students to type what they want to do, what they want to say, but don't hit return until you tell them, okay, now's the time, let's see what all the comments are on this. And it allows for more dynamic chatting. And there's a lot of different usages of mentors. One participant talked about how they have mentor facilitated breakout rooms. Another one talked about how they've kind of like speed dating, where they have a different room with a different topic with a mentor in each, and at certain times they switch the teams around. We're doing a lot with we're pushing a lot of the teaching towards the mentors so that there's more individualized instruction instead of relying so much on lectures, breakout rooms, et cetera. So we had a lot of talking about different techniques that make the students more engaged.
Mm-hmm. Very good. It's really important. Thank you very much. Victoria.
Hi, Jerry. Thank you. Yeah, like others have noted, we had a great discussion with our group. We had a variety of different types of people in our group. A lot of what we discussed has already been summarized here by others, so I won't repeat that. But one thing that came up at the end of our discussion, towards the end, were concerns around privacy. We had a good discussion around that. Not a lot of solutions to share necessarily, because a lot of the questions were kind of specific to their particular circumstances or the type of class or projects that they were working on. But I do think that that's an issue that obviously came up in our group as a broad concern for a variety of the participants. And maybe it's worth, as you get the summary slides, if there's information around that, to kind of put that together for people to consider as well. But I won't repeat the other suggestions because they're all.
That's fine. And Stephanie is now available. Thank you very much, Victoria. Stephanie's now available.
Yeah, hi. So I'm not going to repeat everything that other people have, but one interesting thing we focused on was technology ideas to create more engagement, because everyone has this engagement issue. And so the group came up with several different things that they were familiar with, something called polleverywhere.com to do polls, Neural.co, innovationwithin.com, which is a platform, and Kahoot, which does quizzes. So worth investigating to see if they might work for you. One issue nobody's mentioned that someone in my group did was the issue of working at home and having family show up in the middle of your running in my case, my dog starts barking. So just to surface that this is something that's different. And then some agreement around customer discovery is easier now. Not so easy to do an MVP, especially if it's hardware, like one person in the group had. And then also no replacement for human interaction when you're exploring investment.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. Todd.
So I'm just going to focus on a couple of areas that were different. We had a great conversation, and I learned a bunch of interesting new techniques I know myself from the folks in the group. First, one of the things we talked about that hasn't been talked about much was in final presentations, how to engage the audience. I shared an idea that we use, which was virtual trade shows, and that worked well. But the other idea I really loved around that was implementing, videos in advance with feedback so that you have things in more small snippets and having more small groups and mentors to get things done. Another thing we talked about was the Lean Launchpad coaching model, this relentlessly direct, big classroom coaching model. How do you break that down in a way that works virtually? And we talked about, people talked about doing pairwise coaching between individuals and teams. I know for us at Northwestern, we ended up having a lot more time to directly coach with teams because of the things that we moved asynchronously. And in a lot of ways, having people in the Hollywood Squares Zoom call leveled the playing field, even versus having them around the table. The two other things we talked about assessment. I want to highlight Professor Banerjee from McGill, who talked about a great peer assessment model she used with scenarios that I thought sounded quite interesting, and I hope she'll share more about it with us. People talked a lot about interviews and that it was easy to get the quantity up, but maybe distilling the information from those interviews was more difficult. I know we moved to using the Testing Business Ideas book, and we saw reliance on more different kinds of experiments once we switched to COVID, but I'll leave it at that. So
Thank you very much, Todd. That's a lot of content. Jeff, you're up.
Hey, thanks, Jerry. Just two quick things. Our group had a great discussion, but two that I'll share. One is we have to take a little bit of extra time to connect with our students on a human level. When times are tough, it's good to make some space for those one-on-one interactions, which are hard to do on Zoom calls. So you got to work extra hard at that. Second piece is, as faculty, we're often, we're good at kind of improvising and maybe not planning ahead as well as we should. But in today's world, with an expectation of higher production value and the use of all these various tools, we're now required to plan ahead and do and just have a higher production value for our courses than we may have been used to in the past. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm glad I'm emeritus. You guys are working too hard. Sid.
So
okay,
a couple of things that we talked about is this whole idea of people are losing faith because there's so much uncertainty, so they're waiting and waiting. And we talked about being proactive and finding ways to engage people regardless, and examples that came out. Also, before we started, we had a great poster session where Laura Belay talked about how you can coach students into conducting these discovery interviews with a few practical tips, and user-centric training. Had a couple of videos that I thought would be very useful for this sort of application in a virtual world. Also, we talked about this, the need for this to gain traction with virtual, because we've been teaching in person for a long time, so we got a lot of experience with it. But in the virtual world, we're just beginning. So there needs to be more, as people get better at it, the more they practice, the better they'll get at it. And there was mixed results. So some students are leaning in, some people are checking out. I think we talked about that. We talked about requiring the camera on, and the few people who talked said that they do require the camera on. But the bottom line is, we're in the middle of this transition, and we are sort of being forced to do what we are telling our students to do, to experiment a lot, to try, to fail fast, to fail forward. And so it's just happening to us.
Okay, very good. I just want to call out that I'm aware we're just running 2 or 3 minutes over, but this is very valuable input. I don't want to cut it off. Jeff, go for it.
Two challenges. We have to realize that some of our students have personal problems. They're maybe suffering financially or medically. They may have sick family members. And also, it's a challenge to have individuals interact with each other is difficult on Zoom. So we have to come up with ways of helping that happen. In terms of resources, there's a great read in HBR, Feedback Fallacy. And another resource is Alex Cowan's 20-minute business model page. Suggestions for the class is one of our members said that they do a peer review process. Specific students evaluate their peer teams and pretend they're at Deloitte or E&Y and they're being paid consultants to consult to the peer team and they get graded on that. So that's a very interesting technique. And then a recommendation was instead of having all the work happen during class, have more work happen in office hours and have shorter classes, longer office hour time.
Excellent. Thank you. Ali Hawks, UK.
Hi there. Thank you. I won't repeat everything again. I'll just go with the kind of the biggest things. One was to increase the frequency of check-ins, but make them more brief, which enabled the educators and instructors to stay in more contact with the students. Another was paying attention to the chat, because what the observations that we found in our group were that absent being able to see social cues of people, that you couldn't call out on people that you thought might be frustrated or didn't quite understand, but by paying attention to the chat and the Zoom thing, you could start to call out people. And a practice to avoid was cold calling, because one of the speakers earlier, you don't know if they're still there, but also you might not just get the same value from it as you would in a classroom. And the last I'll start with, which hasn't been noticed here, is that one participant observed that the startup ecosystem they felt is suffering because it's not in person. So it was about what are the ways that the ecosystems around the problems students or organizations are working on could continue to thrive. And some solutions, one solution that's working really well is having a Facebook group replicating what the group is actually doing. And I think those were the major things. The others were just very quickly kind of an observation that the nature of the instructor is actually changing. So the teacher becomes more of a coach versus the instructor. And so what is the role shift in actually being an educator on these types of courses, and the trade-off between spontaneity and structure? And I'll leave it there.
Perfect. Tom O'Neill, Central Florida. Tom, okay, we'll give you 30 seconds to find your mute button, and we'll go to Rahika.
Okay, the disadvantage of going last is a lot of the issues have already been covered. I think I'll just talk about two quick things. Of course, the biggest issue was engagement. So we talked a lot about how to deal with engagement, and some of the things are things you've heard about guest speakers. There was a suggestion to make the presentation shorter, so 4 minutes instead of 8, which also forces the students to really focus on the essence of what they're trying to say. And so that's a great tool. Breakout rooms. I think breakout rooms came out as a really important tool. We talked about, putting pairs of teams in breakout rooms so they could learn from each other. One of the folks in the meeting talked about how students find it very hard to evaluate themselves and evaluate what the next steps were, but really easy to advise others, which is what a lot of us have found. And so they pair them up and make feedback an essential part of the program. So that's the other thing that came out strongly, is feedback needs to be an essential part of the entire course, because that really forces the students to pay attention and interact more. We talked some about customer discovery, how easy or hard it might be to do in these times. One important thing that came up was it's really important to do workshops with the students in advance, just focused purely on how to do interviews. That seemed to help a lot. We talked about, getting them to, go to mailing lists, Reddit groups, where they are likely to find folks interested in their domain. And one of the participants said, like, if you couldn't find anybody interested in your domain out there, that might be a signal that it's time to pivot.
That's a clever one.
A lot of the students, when we taught in Santa Cruz too, we found cold calling helped a lot. So doing, research online, finding people who've written papers in the area, cold calling, sending cold call emails, people seemed to have a lot more time and were open to responding to cold emails. So that was one of the big things.
That several times, yeah.
Yeah. I'll stop here.
Well, thank you very much, Radhika. That was fantastic. John Blaho.
Hey, Jerry.
How are things in New York?
Yep. Yeah, I'm going to riff on Radhika just started, and continue to discuss engagement. And one of the key things that we got is that you have to engage the students as early as possible. One of the discussions was to actually engage them, begin engaging with them before the course even begins. And like Radhika, the question of breakout rooms was probably the most rich discussion we had. And one lesson learned is that always begin with an activity. Begin your session in the breakout room with an activity, otherwise you lose the students. A corollary to that is the breakout room activity has to be very well orchestrated. Everybody needs to know what's going on. Everybody needs what's going to happen in the breakout room, kind of like what we did in this breakout session. There was a structure. One thing that is a challenge that we need to address is the whiteboard issue. There was a big discussion on which platform to use for the whiteboard, and there was some debate there. And then on the last point that she brought up, there is an issue, especially in the larger classes, that how do you engage the teams that aren't presenting, that people have the monitors off? And one approach that wasn't mentioned is to ask the other students what they think of what was just presented.
Right.
Okay, and that's a lesson to share. And I'll stop with that, Jerry. Those
Thank
are
you.
new ones.
Thank you very much, John. Appreciate it. Kim, take us home.
We'll do that. I'll do my best. Thanks, Jerry. So much, of course, has been said already that I won't repeat, but just a few things. There are students who don't like to have their cameras turned on, and there was a suggestion to kick off with an engagement that requires everyone to turn on their screens, which could be Post-it notes, giving high fives, could be silly, but just a way to get people to right off the bat turn on their screens. Second thought was, this is, again, underscoring what has been said, but lots of short videos, breakouts, interactive, kind of well-structured sessions versus long sessions of, one speaker talking. We talked about some tools, something in Blackboard called Pack Back, rather. That's backpack backwards. That's an interesting community board. Talked about Brightspace and Canvas a little bit. And also some new stuff that's coming along, like High Fidelity, that allows you to kind of wander around, hear other people's conversations, wander to another group. There's some interesting new kind of virtual reality tools that are coming out. Also, another suggestion was something called No More Boring Webinars. It's a sort of a set of videos, but it sounds like there's some interesting tools and tips in there. And then final thought is just every time you do this, it's an experiment. And sort of let's follow our own advice. It's okay to fail. Try stuff.
So we have, thank you very much, Kim. That was artfully done. And thank you to all the breakout room leads. You had the real challenge. You really carried the bulk of this session for us, and you've made real contributions. Thank you very much. So a little impromptu compression here of the calendar, because I want to keep to the time commitment, but I do want to get everybody's contribution. So I'm going to go around the horn and just ask for closing comments, and Steve Blank will get the last shot before I close the session. But impromptu, you weren't warned. I'm going to ask Steve Weinstein, and then Pete, and then Grant.
I just want to say that it's amazing to be part of this movement and be part of all this. I've learned a lot today, and I think there's been so much to take in that I don't have a strong closing remark. So thank you all.
Fantastic. Pete?
So I'm going to ditto Steve, but I'm going to add that just watching the chat session and listening to folks and looking at the newly open Slack channel, we have collected a considerable amount of interesting ideas and data and tools and other things. And I'll just, once again, I'll pimp the Common Mission Project team, who has the enviable task of having to organize all this and get it handy. But we'll be reaching back out and asking folks to help put it together and organize it and keep this site up and running, so that this doesn't have to be a once every 6 month discussion amongst it, but we can actually move forward with some of these ideas and build on them. So thanks again to the entire team.
Before we move to Grant, Alex, if you would advance the slide to the resources slide, I think that would be a good one to have up. Thank you. And that'll echo where we're headed. Grant.
Yeah, so I love to see us eating our own dog food. So turning the tools of discovery and experimentation on ourselves. So I think all of the feedback in the sessions have been really great. and certainly encourage everyone to kind of connect on LinkedIn and Slack, et cetera, to keep the discussion going.
All right. Alex. I'm not certain if Alex is still online. Okay, fine. Steve Blank.
So I have to tell you, it's incredibly humbling to see 300 and some odd people do a much better job of teaching the class than I do, and coming up with much better ideas and much better tools and much better insights. And I think has been mentioned, that means we have a successful movement here. Is that all of you have seen value in the core process, and I think every one of you have been making it better, and I hope we continue to do that, and hope when we meet again in December we'll be able to do that again. So thanks to all of you, and again, it's just a mind blower if you think that we're all kind of working to make this form of experiential education better for teaching and better for our students.
Thank you, Steve. So I'll close with a personal remark, because there's been so much said about the content and process. I wouldn't want to try and add to that. The journey that started for me when Steve Blank walked into my office and said, "Hey, I want to teach." I had no idea what I was getting involved in. And I think we've all had somewhat of that experience. Somewhere along the line, Steve's influence has impacted us. And it's probably in some ways, for some of us modestly and for some of us significantly, changed the way we do what is our core mission, which is to teach and share. It changed for me, and I am thankful for that. And part of that process for me has been sharing with faculty, not just sharing with the with the beneficiary, the customer, the beneficiary. That the beneficiary might be the student, but a principal audience or customer segment for me over my career has evolved to be the faculty itself. And when I reached out to Steve a year ago or so and said, you know, the NSF has sort of dropped the ball. We used to have these faculty meetings. We haven't had any. I want to organize, you know, a party. I want to organize a chance to get together and share. And that's what we did last December. And now, you know, 6 months later, I reached out to Steve and said, let's do something online. Let's partner together with others and make this thing happen. And I think now we have a flow. And I think, speaking to Pete's concept of the repository and an online discussion or an ongoing discussion, I just want to make the personal statement that for me, it's very gratifying, and I'm very pleased to be a part of it. So thank you all for joining us today, spending 3 active hours together. And we all look forward to something in December, but much more before then. If it's not face-to-face, it'll be virtual. And there were great recommendations into how to do this better. I loved some of the ideas that came up in the chat stream. So please share more with us. And thank you to our speakers. Thank you to our discussion group leaders. Thank you very much to the Common Mission Project at helping us actually make this happen. We all know what work that takes. Thank you to our outreach sponsors and you know, to GCEC and VentureWell for helping out with that. And thank you all for participating. Let's give ourselves a round of applause. Ciao.
Oh, we can unmute and applause.
Thank you.
That's right. All right. Thanks all. Thanks, Jerry, Steve, Pete, Steve, Alex.
Outstanding.
Logan.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Outstanding.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Thank you all.